Welcome back to This Day in Scottish History. I'm your host, Colin MacDonald. Today, we look back at a key moment in Scotland's social and political history as the country voted on the question of alcohol prohibition on December 5th, 1920. Though the majority of Scotland rejected the idea of banning alcohol in their communities, about 40 districts voted in favour, marking a significant chapter in the temperance movement that had long shaped public policy and attitudes towards alcohol. The temperance movement in Scotland, which advocated for the reduction or complete prohibition of alcohol, was a powerful force in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In response to the growing influence of temperance campaigners, the UK Parliament passed the Temperance Scotland Act 1913, which allowed for local referendums on whether or not alcohol should be prohibited in individual districts. These referendums were a direct result of growing concerns about public health, social problems, and the disruptive effects of alcohol consumption in Scotland. The 1913 Act was part of a broader temperance movement that saw significant political and social mobilisation. Scottish reformers sought to reduce alcohol consumption, citing its links to poverty, domestic violence, and poor working conditions. However, these reformers faced strong opposition from brewers, publicans, and others within the alcohol industry who formed their own committees to resist the growing temperance pressure. The Act allowed local areas, burghs, parishes, and wards to hold a poll where voters could choose between three options: maintaining the status quo, no change, reducing the number of alcohol licenses by 25%, or abolishing all licenses altogether, prohibition. For prohibition to succeed, it required more than a simple majority. It needed at least 55% of the vote in favour of no licence and at least 35% of all registered voters in the district to participate in the poll. This high threshold made it difficult for prohibition to succeed in many areas, especially in larger urban centres. The first referendums took place in June 1920, with the bulk of voting happening in November and December of that year. Despite the efforts of the temperance movement, which had hoped to hold polls in over 1,000 districts, only 584 petitions succeeded. Voter turnout was relatively low, and when the votes were tallied, the results showed a clear rejection of prohibition. Across Scotland, 60% of voters chose no change, meaning they wanted to maintain the existing licensing system, while 38% voted for complete prohibition and just 2% supported a reduction in licenses. Nevertheless, a number of areas did vote in favour of prohibition, with 40 districts choosing to go dry. Some of these areas included Airdrie, Cambuslang, Kilsyth, Kirkintilloch, and Stewarton. Glasgow, which had a strong temperance movement, saw a number of wards voting for prohibition. However, due to the complicated voting system and the supermajority requirement, prohibition was only successfully implemented in 4 wards in Glasgow, despite a majority of voters in 11 wards supporting no licence. This discrepancy illustrates the challenges and complexities of the 1913 Act's provisions. While the overall vote was against prohibition, the results did not mark the end of the temperance movement or the issue of alcohol regulation in Scotland. In fact, the issue continued to spark debates and further votes in subsequent years. Many of the districts that voted to go dry held new votes within a few years, often with the support of the alcohol industry. By 1927, the majority of these votes had reversed prohibition, leaving only a handful of areas with alcohol bans. Lerwick in the Shetland Islands remained dry until 1947. In the following decades, the 1913 Act and its provisions were gradually superseded by new legislation, most notably the Licensing Scotland Act 1959, which consolidated Scottish licensing law. However, the 1913 Act's legacy lived on, with some local areas continuing to hold votes on the issue of alcohol licensing well into the 20th century. The practice of holding local option polls eventually faded out, with the last of these votes taking place in the 1970s. The temperance movement, though it never fully succeeded in its goal of nationwide prohibition, had a lasting impact on Scottish society. It helped to shape public policy on alcohol regulation and contributed to broader debates about public health, morality, and social order. The legacy of these debates continues today as Scotland grapples with issues related to alcohol consumption, public health, and social responsibility. So, as we look back on December 5th, 1920, and the outcome of Scotland's referendum on alcohol prohibition, we see how a powerful social movement intersected with political processes to shape the nation's future. While the majority of Scots rejected the idea of prohibition, the votes in favour in certain areas serve as a reminder of the deep divisions within the country over the issue of alcohol and its role in society. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. Tune in tomorrow for another fascinating episode of This Day in Scottish History. I'm Colin MacDonald. Hasty back.